Look at you. Some black lady with a busted purse walks in here claiming DC sent her to save us, and I'm supposed to do what exactly? Roll out a red carpet. Chief Raymond Holloway did not wait for an answer because men like Raymond Holloway had spent 30 years arranging rooms so that they never had to wait for anyone. And certainly not for a black woman standing in the lobby of his station at 8:47 in the morning with a worn leather messenger bag on her shoulder and the quiet, unhurried posture of someone who had already decided how this day was going to end. Her name was Dara Okafor, 38 years old. Special agent with the Federal Counterterrorism Division. Daughter of Sergeant First Class. Isaiah Okafor. United States Army retired a man who had spent 22 years teaching his daughter that dignity was not the noise a person made, but the line they refused to cross inside themselves, no matter who was watching and no matter who was not. Dara had driven through Atlanta traffic that morning with a cracked encrypted phone balanced on the passenger seat, a black notebook open to a page of small, precise handwriting, and a sealed envelope in the front pocket of her bag that contained 7 names written by hand, names she checked every morning, the way other people checked the weather, not because she needed reminding, but because some things deserved to be carried consciously rather than dragged behind you without knowing it. She was not a large woman, and she did not take up much space in the lobby, which was the kind of observation that men like Holloway made about women like Dara, and then used to arrange the rest of their thinking around never understanding that the amount of space a person occupied and the amount of power they carried had never once in human history been the same measurement. The station lobby was the kind of room that told you everything you needed to know about the people who ran it before anyone opened their mouth. A bronze plaque on the far wall with the names of fallen Atlanta officers engraved in gold. 3 officers near the hallway who were pretending very hard not to watch what was happening at the front desk. A security camera mounted in the upper corner that no one had looked at yet this morning, and an older black man in a veteran's cap sitting in a plastic chair near the window, who had clearly been waiting long enough to form strong opinions about every person who had walked through those doors since he arrived. Holloway looked at Dara's bag the way certain men look at things that belong to other people, with the specific contempt of someone who has decided that ownership is determined by confidence rather than by fact. And then his hand shot out, rough and sudden, grabbing the worn leather strap and wrenching it sideways with enough force that the stitching gave way all at once, snapping clean, sending the bag and everything in it scattering across the lobby floor in a wide arc that seemed to take forever, and no time at all. The black notebook skidded 3 feet and stopped against the base of the front desk. The encrypted phone landed face down on the tile with a crack that suggested the screen already fractured from a previous fall had just gotten worse. The folded photograph of Isaiah Okafor in his army dress uniform slid quietly across the floor and came to rest near the toe of Holloway's left shoe, as if even in 2 dimensions the man knew how to position himself in a room. The badge case, the one Holloway had never asked to see, never asked about, never considered, might contain something that would rearrange his entire morning, skidded beneath the lip of the front desk and disappeared from view. And the sealed envelope, the one with 7 names, written in Dara's careful handwriting, fell open at the fold, spilling its contents across the cold tile, like quiet witnesses who had been waiting for exactly this moment to be seen. Holloway looked down at the mess and gave a short, cruel laugh. The kind of laugh that was not really about finding something funny, but about announcing that you were the kind of person who could make a mess of someone else's belongings and feel good about it. "Well, would you look at that," he said. Washington's finest came prepared with a junk drawer. Dara stood still. Her face did not change, and that stillness, that absolute refusal to give Holloway the reaction he had reached for, bothered him more than anger would have. More than tears, would have more than almost anything she could have said or done. Because men like Holloway had built their entire sense of authority on the belief that they could always provoke a response, and a woman who simply stood there and watched him with calm, dark eyes was a woman who was not playing the game he knew how to win. The veteran in the corner stood up slowly, one hand on the armrest. "Chief," he said, his voice carrying the particular weight of an older man who has decided that something is worth the cost of saying it. "That's enough." Holloway turned on him with the practiced speed of a man who keeps several responses ready for people who step out of line. "Sit down before you make this your problem." The old man's jaw tightened, and Dara gave him the smallest possible shake of her head. Not a dismissal, not a surrender, but a signal that said, "I see you, and I am asking you to wait." And the veteran sat back down, slowly watching Holloway with the kind of eyes that remember everything. Dara lowered herself to one knee and picked up her father's photograph first, her thumb brushing across his face for one brief second before she folded it carefully and placed it into what remained of the bag. Then the notebook. Then the phone, the screen now cracked in 2 directions. Then the envelope with its 7 names, which she refolded along the original crease without appearing to check whether all the names were there, though she knew they were because she always knew. The badge case was still under the front desk. She did not reach for it. She rose, held the torn bag against her side with one hand, looked at Raymond Holloway's face for exactly as long as she needed to, and said 4 words. "I heard everything you said." Holloway blinked. He had expected a speech. He had expected a threat, a credential, a display of authority. He had not expected to be heard, because hearing implies that the other person was worth listening to, and Dara Okafor said those 4 words with the specific tone of a woman who meant them as an observation rather than a complaint. A notation in the record of the morning, accurate and calm and completely without the anger he needed her to have. He did not know yet what that meant. He would learn. Sergeant Roy Dempsey was 61 years old, and his wedding ring had been worn to a thin gold line by 3 decades of marriage. And the eyes behind his reading glasses carried the specific exhaustion of a man who had seen too many things and chosen more times than he liked to count to let them pass without comment, because the cost of intervening had always seemed just slightly higher than he was willing to pay on any given day. He walked Dara down the hallway toward interview room 2 with his hands at his sides, and the torn bag's broken strap catching the light with every step she took. And when he opened the door to the room, he paused with his hand on the frame and said quietly, without looking directly at her, "I'm sorry about the bag." Dara looked at him steadily. "Are you?" He swallowed. "I should have stepped in sooner." "Yes," she said. And the word was not cruel, but it was honest, and honest answers to honest admissions are often harder to receive than any insult because insults give you something to push against, and honesty just sits there in the air between 2 people waiting to be acknowledged. Dempsey nodded, once pushed the door open and left her to it. Interview room 2 smelled of old coffee that had been brewed and forgotten, and then brewed again so many times that the smell had become structural part of the walls. The same way paint was part of the walls, and the fluorescent light overhead was the particular shade of white that made everyone look guilty of something. There was a metal table, 2 chairs, a one-way mirror along the right wall, and a camera in the upper corner that Dara clocked immediately without appearing to look at it. The room was designed to make people feel smaller than they were. She had spent her career refusing to accommodate that design. She placed her items on the table in a specific order that was not random. The encrypted phone first, then the notebook opened to the page she had been working on that morning, then the envelope with its 7 names, then the folded photograph of her father, and finally the badge case which she set at the edge of the table closest to the door where anyone entering would have to make a deliberate choice about whether to acknowledge it. The handwriting on the open notebook page was small and precise and arranged in clean columns. Times dispatch references, camera marker codes, vehicle descriptions, grid coordinates, and it told the story of a woman who had not arrived at this station unprepared, but had in fact been building the shape of the morning's threat since before she left her hotel room using data that the Atlanta field station had access to but had not assembled correctly because they were looking at the wrong place for the wrong reason and had been encouraged to do so by someone they trusted completely. Holloway came back. He stood in the doorway and looked at the items on the table, the way he had looked at the bag with the evaluating contempt of a man deciding whether something has any value. And when his eyes landed on the photograph of Isaiah Okafor, he said, "That your daddy," and leaned slightly forward and added, "Bet he'd be real proud seeing you crawl around my lobby." Two younger officers were visible through the gap in the doorway, not quite inside the room, positioned in the specific way of people who want to hear something but need to be able to claim they were not listening. Dara opened her notebook to the marked page and turned it so the columns faced the ceiling. "Your department has been treating City Hall as the primary target," she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact that needed correcting. Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Because it is the primary target. 3 threat calls mentioned it by name." 3 threat calls mentioned it. Dara agreed, because someone wanted your department looking downtown at government buildings on a Saturday morning. She turned the notebook toward him briefly, then pulled it back. "The Harmon Veterans Memorial Convention Center opens for the memorial program in less than 3 hours. 12,000 attendees are expected, mostly veterans, their families, first responders, and press. That is a symbolic target with a civilian density that City Hall will not have today." Holloway stepped further into the room, and the 2 officers outside shifted slightly closer to the door. "You got all of that from sitting in my lobby?" "I got some of it before I arrived," Dara said. "I confirmed the rest by watching your people walk past me while your chief was busy destroying my belongings." Holloway's face darkened in the specific way of a man who has just been told something true that he does not want to be true, which is a different kind of darkening than anger alone. He took another step toward her, and Dara's thumb rested lightly on the open page of the notebook, and she looked at the clock on the wall rather than at him, because time was now the only thing in the room that deserved her full attention. On the operations floor, Deputy Chief Garrett Voss stood in front of the large display screens with his arms folded, and the particular expression of a senior officer who has spent so many years being trusted that trust has stopped feeling like a gift and started feeling like a right. He was 59 years old, silver-haired, lean in the way of a man who had kept himself physically disciplined long past the years when discipline was required by anything except habit, and his uniform was pressed with the kind of precision that suggested either extraordinary personal standards or someone at home who still took care of those things for him. Officers straightened when Voss entered a room. Younger detectives used his name when they needed to end arguments. Civilians thanked him in grocery stores for things he may or may not have actually done. He wrote condolence letters by hand when officers died, and he knew every spouse's name, and he showed up early to things that other people showed up late to, and none of that was an act exactly, which was what made him so effective at the parts of himself that were. Holloway gave him a version of the federal agent situation that was accurate on the surface and stripped of all the things that would make him look bad, which is to say, it was the version of events that focused on Dara's presumed arrogance, rather than on what Holloway had done to her bag in the lobby while the security camera recorded every second of it from above. Voss listened with what appeared to be mentorship. He asked 2 careful questions. He nodded thoughtfully. Then he turned back to the screens. The operations board showed a city laid out in zones with City Hall circled twice in red marker, and the Harmon Veterans Memorial Convention Center listed in smaller text beneath a secondary priority heading, as though it were an afterthought rather than a building that would have 12,000 people inside it before noon. The threat matrix on the left screen had been built from 3 anonymous call logs, 2 online posts, and 1 suspicious vehicle report near the municipal parking garage downtown, a chain of evidence pointing clearly and cleanly toward a government building on a Saturday, pointing so clearly and so cleanly that a careful person might have paused to wonder whether it was pointing or leading. Voss had built this threat matrix. He had received the original data, arranged the response structure, and the previous afternoon he had personally walked the convention center's security team through their event perimeter plan, using a floor plan of the building that was 2 renovations out of date and did not include the service corridor that had been added in a 2019 construction project, a corridor that ran beneath Hall C and connected directly to the lower loading dock through a passage wide enough to move equipment through without crossing any public security checkpoint. He had told the convention center security team that City Hall was the main concern. He had said it with the calm authority of a man who has been right about these things before, which is the most persuasive tone there is. Now he watched the operations board and said nothing about the convention center, and when one analyst mentioned the event as a crowd management consideration, Voss turned toward him with a patient expression and said that uniformed presence near the plaza would be sufficient, and that the real operational attention needed to stay on downtown government structures through at least early afternoon. The analyst nodded. Of course he did. It was Garrett Voss. In interview room 2, Dara used her cracked phone to send a single encrypted message to a relay number that was not in any Atlanta department database. The screen flickered under her thumb, the fractures in the glass catching the fluorescent light. But the signal went through, and the message was brief, and the people who received it had been waiting for it since 7:15 that morning when her flight landed. In the lobby, Dempsey stood near the front desk and looked at the security camera in the upper corner for a long moment, and then he looked at the scuff marks on the tile floor where Dara's belongings had scattered, and then he looked at the bronze plaque with its gold-lettered names of people who had died in service of a standard this building was supposed to uphold, and he made a decision that he would spend the rest of the morning trying to live up to. The front doors of Atlanta Police Headquarters opened at 8:56 in the morning, with the specific kind of force that is not loud but carries anyway the force of purpose rather than drama, and the sound of boots on tile followed, not running, not hesitating, moving with the controlled economy of people who have learned that urgency and composure are not opposites but partners. Commander James Whitfield came through first. Early 50s, broad-shouldered, wearing a black tactical vest over a dark uniform with his rank visible at the collar and his face carrying the weathered, unhurried calm of a man who has walked into genuinely dangerous places often enough that the performance of calm has long since become the real thing. His hair was cropped close and gray at the temples, and his eyes moved through the lobby in the automatic professional sweep of someone who is never quite in a room, the same way other people are in a room, always slightly wider, always tracking the edges. Behind him came 6 SWAT officers in full tactical gear rifles slung low across their chests, boots striking the tile in the quiet rhythm of people who have trained together long enough that their movement has become a single thought expressed by 6 bodies. They were not dramatic about it. That was what made it effective. Whitfield's gaze passed over the lobby, the clerk behind the desk, the 2 young officers near the hallway, the veteran in the plastic chair who had straightened and was watching the door with the alert posture of a man whose body still remembered how to stand when something was happening. And then Whitfield's voice came out clear and unhurried and carrying to every corner of the room. "Where is Agent Dara Okafor? Not, is there a federal agent here? Not, we're looking for someone. Where is she?" The question assumed she was present, that she had a name, that the name mattered, and that the answer was owed immediately, and the lobby felt all of that in the 2 seconds of silence that followed. Holloway appeared from the hallway entrance, moving fast, his face doing the complicated calculation of a man who knows something has shifted but has not yet accepted that it has shifted against him. "Commander Whitfield," he said with the particular loudness of a man trying to fill space before someone else can. "This is my building, and you don't come through those doors without clearing it through my office." Whitfield did not look away from the lobby. I cleared it through the governor's emergency liaison and the federal counterterrorism desk. He paused for exactly 1 beat. "You weren't notified. I am aware I wasn't notified." That appears to be a pattern this morning. Whitfield said it the way you say something that is simply accurate without editorial emphasis, and somehow that was worse than any sharpness would have been. A young officer near the back wall coughed into his fist, and Holloway turned toward him with his eyes hot, and the officer looked at the floor, and the lobby understood that the dynamic of the morning had just been rearranged by 2 sentences. Whitfield's eyes moved through the room again, and this time they stopped on specific things: the torn leather strap lying on the counter near the front desk, the faint scuff marks on the tile, a dark scrap of strap leather near the base of the door. He did not name what he was seeing. His face changed by 1 degree the way a careful man's face changes when he has gathered enough information to draw a conclusion and is choosing to hold it until the right moment. Dempsey stepped forward from his position near the wall, and his voice was lower than usual and steadier than it had been all morning, the voice of a man who has finally found the thing he is willing to say out loud. Chief grabbed her bag off her shoulder when she came in, he said. Strap snapped. Her things went across the floor. Holloway went very still. Whitfield looked at Dempsey for a moment, not evaluating, just receiving, and then he said, "Thank you, Sergeant," and turned back toward the hallway. Agent Okafor. The name said like that, with the title before it, and the specific quiet certainty of a man who has never once been unsure about whether she deserved it, that said more than anything else that had happened in the lobby all morning. Dara came down the hallway from interview room 2 with her damaged bag held against her side, the broken strap trailing, and she moved the way she had moved all morning, which was to say, she moved like a woman who had used the time in that room, well, rather than like a woman who had been kept waiting. And the officers who saw her come through the hallway door stepped aside. Not in deference yet, but in the specific uncertainty of people who are beginning to understand that they have misjudged something important. Whitfield met her eyes. Agent Okafor, Commander. One word. Professional and immediate, the shorthand of two people who have operated in the same world long enough to know that efficiency in a crisis is its own form of respect. Holloway tried one last time. Nobody moves operational material without my authorization. This is still my department. Whitfield finally turned to face him fully, and his voice did not rise even slightly. Chief? With respect, you are no longer the deciding authority in this operation. You can help, or you can stand aside. The lobby waited. Holloway's jaw worked once. Something moved across his face that was not quite anger and not quite shame, but lived in the territory between them where men go when they have spent a morning building something and are beginning to understand it was built wrong. Dara was already walking toward the operations floor. She had a city to save and less than an hour to do it, and Raymond Holloway's pride was not something she could afford to carry alongside everything else. The operations room was the kind of room that believed in itself. Large screens showing the city in grid form, radio channels open and crackling, officers at desks with the focused posture of people who have been told that what they are doing matters and have not yet been given reason to doubt it. Coffee cups sat beside keyboards. A half-eaten breakfast biscuit cooled in its paper wrapper near the window. The whiteboard at the front of the room held a list of threat locations with City Hall at the top, circled twice in red marker, with the specific confidence of a conclusion that no one had thought to question. Dara stopped in front of the board. She stood there for 3 seconds reading it, and then she picked up the marker from the tray and drew a single line through City Hall. A detective near the back of the room pushed back from his desk. "Hey, we've been working that angle since midnight." Dara turned to look at him. "I know," she said. "That is why someone gave it to you." The detective opened his mouth. Closed it. Behind him, Whitfield stepped to one side and said nothing because he understood that some corrections needed to happen without commentary from the side. Dara uncapped the marker and wrote beneath the crossed-out name, Harmon Veterans Memorial Convention Center. She set the marker down and faced the room. The 2019 renovation of this building added a lower service corridor connecting the loading dock to the area beneath Hall C, she said. Your department's floor plan does not include it because you are working from an outdated building schematic. That corridor is wide enough to move equipment through without crossing any public security point. An analyst at the traffic desk typed something quickly and pulled up a file on her screen. "She's right," she said, almost to herself, and then louder. "I've got the updated city permits here. The corridor exists. Traffic camera E17. Dara said at Peachtree and Forsyth 542 this morning. White utility van, partial plate match to a vehicle flagged in the morning threat log." She waited. The analyst pulled the image. Now E22. Dara said 17 minutes later, 2 blocks south of the convention center. The second image appeared. 2 vans, same plate, but the rear passenger panel of the first van had a dent. The second van was clean. The analyst leaned toward her screen. "The dent is missing." Cloned plate, Dara said. The City Hall van was a decoy. The real vehicle moved to the convention center service zone while your people were watching government buildings downtown. The room had stopped performing casualness. People were actually looking at the screens now, at the board, at each other, with the specific alertness of professionals who have just been shown that the problem they thought they understood is a different shape than they believed. Holloway came through the door behind them, still breathing hard from following them down the hallway, and when he saw the crossed-out City Hall on the board, his face did the rapid sequence of disbelief and fury and wounded authority. "You do not erase my board," he said. Dara looked at the screens, rather than at him. "Pull camera E17 and E22 and compare the rear quarter panels," she said to the analyst. "Document both images side by side." I said, "Chief." Whitfield's voice was quiet and final. "Let her finish." Holloway moved into the room toward Dara with the forward momentum of a man who has spent his career using physical presence to end conversations, and Dara saw him coming the way she saw most things without appearing to track it. Her awareness simply broader than he expected it to be, and when his hand reached for her arm, it found nothing but air, and then physics, because Dara moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who learned a long time ago that force is not about size but about angle and timing, and one moment Holloway was reaching for her, and the next his knees buckled and his body met the operations room floor with enough force to rattle a coffee cup on the nearest desk. There was no flourish. There was no anger in it. It was simply the logical conclusion of a bad decision made in public, applied cleanly. Holloway lay on the floor, red-faced, one hand pressed against the tile, looking up at the ceiling of his own operations room with the expression of a man who has not been on this side of a power exchange in 30 years and does not know what to do with the view from here. Dara did not look at him. "Commander Whitfield," she said, turning to the city grid. "What's our play?" Whitfield looked at the man on the floor for one brief second, and then he looked at the map, and his voice was calm and immediate. "Agent Okafor, take the board." Behind them, Chief Raymond Holloway lay on the floor of his own operations room, surrounded by screens that were already reorganizing themselves around the truth that a black woman in a torn leather bag had walked in and handed them at 8:47 in the morning. And no one in the room, not a single officer, not a single analyst, not the detective whose morning angle had just been crossed out in red marker, moved to help him up. He was not hurt. He was simply where he had put himself, which was exactly as far from what mattered as it was possible to get. There is a specific kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. The courage of giving people accurate information in the calmest possible voice, while your hands want to shake and your mind is running calculations about how many minutes you have left before the calm voice stops being enough. And Dara Okafor had been practicing this particular kind of courage since she was 26 years old, and had learned that panic was a luxury she could not afford to offer anyone who needed to survive what she was about to tell them. She laid out the evacuation plan in 3 rings. The first ring, visible uniformed officers at all public entrances to the convention center, calm posture. Civilian-friendly, no language or body position that would suggest threat. The second ring, plainclothes officers and volunteers inside the building using staff corridors and service exits, moving people out in small groups with explanations that were technically true and emotionally manageable. Plumbing concern, near Hall C seating adjustment fire panel test. The third ring, SWAT, moving on the loading dock and the lower service corridor from the east stairwell, which was narrower and less expected than the dock approach and therefore safer. Whitfield nodded through each ring without interrupting, which was the mark of a commander who understood that the fastest way to move through a briefing was to let the person doing it finish. Denise Pruitt had worked the dispatch console for 22 years and had the particular composure of a woman who has talked people through things that should not happen to anyone. Officers down. Children missing fires in occupied buildings. The kind of nights that you go home from and sit in your car in the driveway for 10 minutes before you can walk inside and be a person again. She was 51, divorced with 2 sons who still called her when their cars made noises they couldn't identify, and she did not consider herself brave so much as she considered herself someone who showed up, which in her experience was most of what bravery actually required. Dara gave her specific instructions, and Denise received them with the focused efficiency of someone who has been waiting all morning for someone to give her something real to do. The convention center director, Karen Whitlock, answered on the second ring, and Dara spoke to her the way she had learned to speak to civilians in a crisis directly without softening the thing that needed to be said, but with enough steadiness in her voice to signal that the appropriate response was calm rather than panic. "There may be a device in or near your building," Dara told her, "and your calm in the next 15 minutes may be the difference between people getting out safely and people getting hurt. I need you to use the fire panel test at 9:30 as cover. Start moving people out of Hall C. Nothing over the PA about bomb threat police or evacuation." Karen's voice trembled once. Then it steadied. "Tell me what to do." Dempsey was given his own specific assignment. Find 6 officers he trusted to follow quiet instructions to the letter. Use them for interior crowd movement. And when talking to veterans who did not want to leave their seats, tell them there was a plumbing issue near Hall C. "Older folks will complain," Dempsey said, "but they'll move." Dara told him that complaining and moving were not different things, and for the first time since 8/47, something close to a real expression crossed Dempsey's face. Denise pulled a traffic hit from the system. A white utility van had entered the convention center service lot 22 minutes ago and had not appeared on any exit camera since. Dara looked at the clock. It was 9:02 in the morning. The memorial program began at 10, but doors had been open since 8:30 for veterans groups, volunteers, choir members, media, crews, and vendor staff. The kind of people who arrived early because some version of service had trained them all their lives to respect time. The clock was not a clock anymore. It was a weight. She thought of her father, and she did not push the thought away, the way she sometimes did. She let it come. Thought of him standing in the hallway of their house the night before every Veterans Day she could remember, ironing his army jacket with the careful attention of a man performing a small private ceremony, smoothing the sleeves with hands that had once carried a rifle and later carried grocery bags for church widows. And she heard his voice as clearly as if he were standing in the operations room beside her. "When people gather to remember sacrifice, baby girl, you stand guard even if nobody asked you to." Across the room, Garrett Voss stood in the doorway near the hall with his arms folded and the expression of a senior officer watching a situation develop, and he took out his personal phone and he turned slightly away from the room before he dialed. No one noticed. Everyone was watching the screens. That was exactly what he had counted on. The first SWAT vehicle left headquarters without sirens, and the silence of that departure was somehow worse than any siren would have been the absence of sound in a city that always had the deliberate quiet of people moving toward something that required them not to be heard. Dara sat in the rear of the lead tactical SUV with Commander Whitfield beside her, and 2 SWAT officers across from them, and Atlanta passed beyond the tinted windows, with the complete indifference of a city that did not know what was being done on its behalf at 9/11 on a Saturday morning. A man in a Braves cap waited at a crosswalk holding 2 coffees. A woman in church clothes walked a small dog past the entrance of an apartment building. 3 teenagers sat on a stoop with their phones out, seeing something on the small screens in their hands that had nothing to do with white vans or service corridors or the weight Dara carried in a torn leather bag. She looked at a grandmother at a bus stop holding a small boy's hand, the boy in sneakers that were slightly too large for him, and she felt the arithmetic of the morning, the way she always did when a crowd was involved. Not as an abstraction, not as a number, but as a fact. Every person was a life with branches, a network of people who would be altered in ways they could not predict or plan for if the thing that was supposed to happen today happened. The grandmother had a kitchen somewhere. The boy had a teacher who expected him Monday. These were the things official reports never put in the casualty column. The Harmon Veterans Memorial Convention Center came into view as they turned southwide, and modern glass and stone and steel American flags lining the front plaza banners hanging from the entrance columns with images of service members and the words, "We Remember," printed large enough to read from the street. Elderly men in veterans' caps walked with careful steps along the sidewalk. A woman in a red, white, and blue scarf guided a man with a walker toward the entrance, her handlight on his elbow. Volunteers moved between the doors with trays of coffee and water. The bomb squad captain, Ellis, met them at the temporary command post behind a parking structure 2 blocks from the building. He was a compact, serious man with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that rushing near certain things was the one mistake you did not get to make twice. The white utility van was confirmed in the service lot. Rear doors padlocked, no driver visible. The robot went in from the maintenance ramp, lower profile, Dara's call, and Ellis did not argue because she had given the right reason, and the feed came back showing a thin black wire running from beneath the van toward the service corridor wall. Denise's voice from headquarters, the wall connected to an electrical access closet that fed emergency lighting for Hall C. If the van device did its job, the darkness and confusion afterward would do what the blast itself might leave unfinished. Then the robot signal cut to static. Dara turned toward the parking structure across the street without hurrying. Upper level, gray sedan, driver visible through a partially open window. She did not point. She told Whitfield quietly, and he relayed the observation to his team with the same quiet, and a SWAT unit began moving with no rush and no announcement. Her cracked phone buzzed in the torn bag, and she pulled it out and read the message on the fractured screen. "You should have stayed invisible." Whitfield read it over her shoulder. "They know you're here." "No," Dara said. She looked at the convention center across the street, at the flags, at the old men still moving through the entrance doors. "They knew before I got here. That's a different problem." The difference settled between them like a cold weight. This was not surveillance that had begun when she walked into the station. This was surveillance that had begun before she landed in Atlanta, which meant someone had told them she was coming, which meant the operation she had walked into was not just a bomb in a parking lot. It was a trap with her name already in it. The sealed envelope with 7 names pressed against her ribs from inside the torn bag, and she did not reach for it, but she felt it the way you feel a specific kind of old scar in cold weather. Not pain exactly, but presence. A reminder that certain things had happened and could not be unhappened, and that the only useful response to that fact was to make sure fewer things like it happened going forward. The rear lights of the white utility van blinked once. No engine, no movement. One deliberate pulse. Someone had just confirmed the device could still receive a signal. The morning moved faster after that. The gray sedan driver was secured without noise, without chase, without the kind of drama that announces itself to a crowd. A controlled approach, a controlled takedown, and then the specific quiet of something having been resolved before it could resolve itself in a worse direction. A modified remote start transmitter was recovered from his right hand. The rear lights of the van did not blink again. The laptop open on the passenger seat showed a live feed from inside Hall C. The crowd moving in the real-time certainty of people who did not know they were being watched, and a signal meter in the corner of the screen that connected to the van outside. Someone had eyes on the crowd, and someone could act on what they saw. Denise pulled the service access pass for the white utility van and read the result in a voice that was entirely flat in the way voices go when the information being communicated is too large for any normal register. The pass had been approved by Deputy Chief Garrett Voss's office. Emergency vendor clearance. Electrical maintenance. Processed the previous afternoon at 4:12 p.m. Whitfield's head turned slowly toward Dara. She did not move, but something in her face settled into the particular stillness of a woman who has just had a suspicion confirmed and finds no satisfaction in the confirmation. Karen Whitlock's voice came through the radio from inside the building. Voss had been at the security walkthrough the previous afternoon. She had met him, shaken his hand, thanked him for his time, and he had told the center's security team personally that City Hall was the main concern for the weekend, and that convention center perimeter coverage at the standard event level would be more than adequate. Dara assembled it for Whitfield in the shortest form she could, because there was no time for anything else. Voss had directed police attention to City Hall. He had given the convention center a lighter perimeter. He had access to the updated building schematics, to vendor clearance protocols, to the department's full response plan for the weekend, and to the notification that a federal counterterrorism agent was arriving Saturday morning. Every door the attack needed to be open had been opened by the same key. Whitfield reached for his phone. Dara put her hand briefly near his arm, not touching it, just near it. If Voss is inside the system, anything official alerts him. Any call from your phone that goes through department channels reaches him before we finish the sentence. Whitfield held the phone. Briggs, he started, then corrected himself. Holloway needs to know. Holloway will react loudly, Dara said. Voss will hear it before we finish the next sentence. She looked at the laptop screen at the faces of old men in veterans' caps moving slowly toward the exits under the gentle fiction of a fire panel test. Keep this through Denise only. Keep Voss in the building without confronting him. Nothing through official channels. Whitfield did not like it. But he understood it, which was enough. A new detail appeared on the laptop screen, a camera angle that was not from the convention center's own security system, positioned above and slightly behind the media platform at the rear of Hall C, showing the crowd from above at a perspective that belonged to a broadcast setup rather than a building monitoring system. The analyst beside them leaned in. That's not internal security. That's a live broadcast feed. Dara looked at the angle at the equipment visible at the edge of the frame, at the specific position that told her everything she needed to know about what the van was and what it wasn't. The van outside was the device they were supposed to find, because finding it would bring every available hand to the service lot and the dock and the perimeter, the obvious logical response of a well-trained team doing exactly what they were trained to do. The camera feed was something else. The camera feed was the thing they were meant to miss while they were busy being right about the van. There's a second device, she said. The van was the visible threat. The real one was inside. Whitfield looked at the monitor at the live image of Hall C with its choir and its folding chairs and its elderly veterans being moved aisle by volunteers who were smiling their way through the most important performance of their professional lives. He looked at Dara. How much time? She was already picking up her damaged bag from the ground where she had set it while reading the laptop screen. She slung the torn strap across her forearm and looked at the entrance to the convention center across the street, at the families still arriving at the flags, at the volunteers with their trays of water, at the whole beautiful, fragile, ordinary human fact of people gathering to remember something that deserved to be remembered. We have minutes, she said. Not more. Whitfield. I have teams for that. We have minutes, Dara said again, and she started walking, and she walked the way she had walked all morning, which was to say, she walked like a woman who had already calculated the cost and was willing to pay it, and the only question was whether she could pay it fast enough. Dara crossed into the Harmon Veterans Memorial Convention Center at 9:32 in the morning, moving against the current of elderly veterans being gently redirected by volunteers who had been told there was a plumbing concern near Hall C and were doing the exhausting, cheerful work of making that sound like good news. A man in a wheelchair being pushed toward the north corridor grumbled steadily about the seat he had reserved 3 weeks ago and was now being asked to abandon for reasons that made no sense to him. And his wife walked beside the chair with her hand on his shoulder and the patient expression of a woman who has been married long enough to know that sometimes the fastest way to move a stubborn man is to agree with him while steering him in the correct direction. Dara felt something move through her chest that was not quite tenderness and not quite grief, but lived between them. This was America too, she thought. Not the speeches and the marble and the ceremony, just old couples who had survived enough years together that irritation had become one of the ways they spoke love, and they deserved to get home tonight and keep doing that. Karen Whitlock met her just inside the main entrance with a radio in one hand and the expression of a woman running 6 things simultaneously and doing none of them badly. 3 local news stations and 1 national cable crew were on the media platform at the rear of Hall C, along with a veterans documentary team, all of them holding clearance from Voss's office authorizing them to remain in position through the mayor's arrival. I tried to move them, Karen said. The lead producer told me the clearance came from the deputy chief personally. Dara said nothing to that. She moved toward Hall C. The platform stood at the rear of the hall, 3 feet above the floor, holding tripods and cameras and the careful arrangement of broadcast equipment that made live television look effortless from the outside and required extraordinary precision from the people running it. Dara climbed the platform steps carefully and stood among the equipment and let her eyes do the work that her hands were not yet ready to do. Everything looked correct. The cameras were positioned correctly. The cables ran in the right general directions. The equipment cases were the right shapes and sizes for the gear they were supposed to contain. She pulled the small flashlight from the side pocket of her torn bag, crouched near the base of the central equipment trunk, and angled the light beneath the platform's wooden support frame. A small black box, no larger than a thick paperback book, was mounted against the underside of the frame with professional precision, not zip-tied, not taped, bolted, and it had a narrow antenna and a fiber line running toward the camera riser and no markings of any kind. Clean installation. The work of someone who knew what they were doing and had done it before in conditions where discovery would have been catastrophic. Whitfield called for Ellis. Dara straightened. 3 minutes, she said quietly. Maybe 2. Ellis arrived with his bomb technician moving fast through the side entrance, and he slid beneath the platform frame and looked at the box for 15 seconds without touching it. And when he came back up, his face had the specific expression of a man who has confirmed something he hoped he was wrong about. Relay, he said. Control architecture. It's not the explosive. It's what talks to the explosive. And then the full shape of it came together in Dara's mind with the cold, geometric clarity of something she had seen before in a different place in a different city, in a corridor she had walked into 6 years ago believing she understood the problem. The van outside was the headline. The relay was the network, and the broadcast cameras on this platform were the trigger mechanism, and everything was connected, and if the broadcast signal dropped, the dead man sequence would complete itself regardless of what anyone did to the van in the service lot. The memory came without permission, a service corridor in another city 6 years ago, a junction box installed half an inch too high, the kind of detail that meant nothing unless you knew what you were looking at. And she had known what she was looking at, and she had said, wait and command, had said, move, and the world had turned white. And 7 names had become what she carried in a sealed envelope. She pressed the memory down. Not because it didn't matter, it mattered enormously. It was the reason she was standing on this platform right now. But because there was not time to carry it at full weight and still do what needed to be done. Don't cut power to the cameras, she told Ellis, and he looked at her with the quick focus of a man who trusts a source when it speaks with that kind of certainty. Loss of broadcast signal may trigger the dead man sequence in the van. The producer from the national cable crew who had been standing near the platform steps refusing to leave went pale in a way that suggested she understood exactly what that meant. Our satellite truck is transmitting from the north lot, she said. We've been live for 20 minutes. Who approved your parking location? Whitfield asked. The producer already knew what the answer was going to be before she said it. Deputy Chief Voss's office. Denise's voice came through the earpiece. Voss had just arrived at headquarters and was asking for operational control to be transferred back to the department. He was asking for it by name. He was asking for Dara specifically by name. He wanted to know exactly where she was. Dara looked at Whitfield. He looked at her. The shape of the trap was now complete, and they were inside it, which meant the only useful thing to do was to understand it well enough to dismantle it from the inside, rather than from the outside, which was harder and slower, but was the only option that did not involve giving Voss what he was waiting for. Keep him blind, Dara said. Do not let Denise open any channel that goes through him. Keep Hall C moving, and get me Ellis with 3 stable minutes. Ellis looked up from beneath the platform. "I can isolate the relay if the signal holds, but I need 3 minutes of no interference." It was 9:38. The last rows of elderly veterans were finally standing, moving slowly toward the exits with the grumbling, dignified cooperation of people who would rather stay but have decided that trust is being offered, and they will extend it this once. A woman near the end of the row stopped to straighten a small American flag pinned to her husband's lapel before allowing her daughter to take her elbow. Her husband waited for her to finish the way he had probably been waiting for her to finish things for 50 years, with the patient love of a man who has learned that some things are worth the pause. Dara watched them and felt the 7 names in her bag pressing against her side, and she thought not one more. 3 minutes, she said to Ellis. Start now. The operations room at Atlanta Police Headquarters had changed in the way that rooms change when authority has been redistributed without anyone making an announcement about it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulated small decisions of people who are beginning to understand that the person they have been waiting for permission from is not the person they should have been waiting for. Officers answered Denise first. Analysts checked with Dempsey before moving updates to the board. When Whitfield's voice came through the main speaker from the convention center, conversations paused and no one looked to Raymond Holloway to decide how to respond. Holloway was still in the room, standing near the main table with his arms at his sides and the expression of a man who is present at an event he no longer controls, but the room had stopped organizing itself around him. Authority, when it goes, rarely goes with drama. It just stops being where it was. Garrett Voss entered at 9:41, and the room responded to him the way it always had, straightening, slightly re-engaging, turning toward him with the automatic deference of people in the presence of someone they have been conditioned to trust. He was silver-haired and composed, and his uniform was immaculate, and he moved to the center of the room with the unhurried ease of a man who belongs in every room he enters because he has spent 30 years making people believe that. He read the screens for 30 seconds. "Why is SWAT inside Hall C?" Denise answered without looking up from her console. Agent Okafor identified a secondary relay inside the building. Commander Whitfield redirected resources based on her assessment. "And where is Agent Okafor now?" Voss's voice carried nothing that could be called suspicion, just the reasonable inquiry of a senior officer catching up on a developing situation. Denise kept her eyes on the console. "On scene at the convention center." Voss moved toward the communications desk. "Open a channel to Commander Whitfield. I need a full status." Denise's hands rested on the console and did not move toward any of the controls that would have opened that channel. Voss waited. Holloway looked at her from across the room. 2 junior officers near the door watched without moving. She thought about her sons, the older one, who had called that morning to ask about something small and completely ordinary, and she had answered while standing in the parking lot of headquarters before her shift, and she had not known then that the day was going to ask her to be something she did not entirely believe she was. She thought about 22 years of calls, of being the voice on the other end of the radio when everything went wrong, of being the person who stayed calm so that the person on the other end could stay calm. And she thought about the particular cost of being the steady one in the room when the unsteady ones want you to move in the wrong direction. "No, sir," she said. Holloway's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me, I said no." She did not raise her voice. She did not look at either of them. Agent Okafor's instructions were clear. This channel stays closed to unauthorized personnel during an active federal operation. Deputy Chief Voss does not currently have clearance to the active operational feed. Voss looked at her with an expression that a man like him kept ready for moments like this. Mild, patient. The expression that said, "I understand you believe you're doing the right thing, and we both know you're wrong." "Denise," he said, using her first name the way senior people use first names, to remind you of the distance between you. "I am the deputy chief of this department." "Yes, sir. And this operation is under federal counterterrorism response authorization. Agent Okafor has operational control. Her instructions stand." Dara's voice came through the speaker before Voss could continue, clear and immediate, and carrying the specific weight of a woman who has been listening and has heard enough. Deputy Chief Voss Dara said. "Step away from the communications desk." The room went absolutely still. Voss turned toward the speaker with something that was not quite surprise, more like the careful reevaluation of a man who has realized the clock is running faster than he calculated. "Agent Okafor," he said, "I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "We haven't," Dara said, "but I have been reading your work all morning. Your office approved the service pass for the white utility van. Your office cleared the media platform crew. Your office directed police attention to City Hall using a threat matrix built on data you controlled. And your office received my arrival notification before I landed in Atlanta." A pause. "The channel Denise locked down 3 minutes ago has been recording since 9:37. Everything you've said in this room is on it." Holloway stared at Voss. The sound he made was not a word. It was the involuntary sound of a man watching 30 years of professional trust disintegrate in front of him in real time. Dempsey, from across the room, his voice steadier than it had been all morning, Deputy Chief Voss. "Hands where I can see them, sir." Voss raised his palms. "Wounded dignity. The performance of a man who has been wrongly accused of something he absolutely did." "This is absurd," he said. "Harold, you can see what's happening here. She's overreaching. She embarrassed you this morning, and now she needs a villain to justify it." Holloway wanted to believe him. Dara could hear it in the silence. But the room had heard too much, and silence after certain things is not agreement. It is the sound of people who have stopped being confused. Voss's hand moved not toward a weapon, not in any way that would have been legible as dangerous to someone who was not watching with the specific attention of someone who had been watching all morning, but toward his belt and toward the inside pocket of his jacket, and the movement was controlled and deliberate, and had the practiced efficiency of a man executing a plan he had made before he walked through the door. Dempsey shouted. Gun before anyone else moved, and in the compressed second that followed, the room erupted into the specific, controlled chaos of law enforcement professionals responding to a declared threat. Officers moving hands, reaching for holsters, bodies angling away from the center while still facing it, and Voss's hand came out of his jacket, not with a firearm, but with a small black device no larger than a car key, and his thumb was already finding the button on top before the nearest officer had closed half the distance between them. Denise screamed from the console. "He's got a trigger." 2 shots, not from across the room. Dempsey was close. He had been moving toward Voss from the moment the hand went toward the jacket. Because 31 years on the job gave you a specific sensitivity to the moment before something terrible happens, and he had finally, on this morning, chosen to act on what he felt rather than wait for permission. The shots hit Voss's forearm, and the device left his hand and skidded across the operations floor, spinning under the edge of the conference table. Voss went down against the wall, clutching his arm, blood darkening his sleeve, and the room finished its adjustment and went still, that specific, active stillness of a space full of trained people waiting to find out whether they are done or whether they are not. Dempsey stood with both hands raised and the weapon still level, smoke lifting in a thin thread from the barrel, his face pale, and both hands trembling because he was 61 years old and had not fired his weapon at a human being in 22 years. And the fact that he had done it correctly and done it in time did not make his hands stop shaking. Denise's voice came through the channel, tight but controlled device secured. "Voss is down but alive." Dara's response was immediate. "Do not touch the trigger. Photograph it first. Bag it in a signal shield if you have one." Dempsey hold the room. Nobody leaves. Voss laughed once, breathless and thin from the floor against the wall. "You still think you won," he said, not quite a question. Dempsey kept the weapon trained on him. "I think you need to be quiet." Voss looked toward the speaker, toward the channel, toward wherever Dara's voice was coming from. "Dallas was authorized," he said. The words dropped into the room without context, without explanation, without anything to soften them, and Dara, listening through the earpiece at the convention center, went very still in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the specific cold recognition of a woman who has been waiting 6 years to hear someone say that out loud. Holloway stared at Voss from across the room, stared at him the way a person stares at something they did not expect to find in a place they thought they understood completely, and the sound he made was very quiet and had no words in it. Denise looked at the device under the edge of the table and then looked at the console and then looked at the speaker through which Dara's voice had come, and she said to no one in particular in the even tone of a woman who has decided that what just happened is going to be the truest thing she ever does in this building. Hall C evacuation is down to 41 civilians and moving. A breath moved through the room. Not a cheer, not a celebration. Just the involuntary exhale of people who have been holding air in their lungs for an hour because releasing it felt like admitting something, and now 41 was a number small enough to feel like it might become 0 in time, and that was as close to hope as the room was going to get for a while. Through the speaker, Dara's voice. Keep them moving. Don't celebrate yet. She knew something the room did not know yet. The trigger in Voss's hand had not been the end. The end was still below them in a loading dock in a trailer with a logo printed slightly wrong, waiting for the moment it believed no one was watching. The new red indicator on the relay laptop appeared at 9:44, and Dara looked at it and understood immediately that the morning had just become a different kind of problem, not larger exactly, but deeper. The way certain holes don't reveal their true depth until you drop something into them and wait for the sound. Secondary timer active. Location code lower loading dock vehicle bay. Not the van in the service lot. A separate device, already inside the building. She ran, and this time she did not moderate her pace for the benefit of anyone who might be watching, because there was no time left for that kind of consideration, and Whitfield ran beside her without asking why, which was one of the things that made him effective in situations that required people to move first and discuss later. The loading dock was below the public level of the convention center, accessed through a service stairwell that smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and old concrete, and the particular cold of spaces that never fully warm up regardless of the season. 3 delivery vehicles were parked inside under the harsh industrial lighting, a catering box truck, a flower van with its back doors open and empty boxes stacked beside it, and a black equipment trailer along the far wall bearing the logo of a stage lighting company in clean white letters. Dara stopped. She stood and looked at the trailer, the way she looked at things she needed to understand before she touched them, and what she saw was a trailer that was too clean for a working loading dock during an active event setup. No road dust on the undercarriage, no scuff marks on the corner bumpers, no condensation ring beneath the wheel hitch where something would have dripped. A vehicle that had been placed rather than parked by someone who understood the difference. Ellis arrived within 45 seconds with his scanner, and the reading came back with shielding. Something inside the trailer was blocking the full scan. He checked the logo more carefully when Dara pointed to it, pulling up the company's actual branding on his phone. Blue lettering, the same font, but lighter, more precise. This logo was navy. Almost right. Not right. An external power cable ran from beneath the trailer's frame to a wall outlet dressed to look like a standard charging line for battery-powered equipment. It was not. "Can't disconnect it," Ellis said. "Cutting external power might close the circuit." "Then we don't touch the wire," Dara said. "We change what the blast hits." It took Ellis a moment, and then he understood. They could not move the device. They could move the room around it, create a blast barrier between the trailer and the interior load-bearing columns that supported the west concourse above them, redirect the force of whatever was inside that trailer away from the structure that, if compromised, would bring part of the building down on top of the people being evacuated from Hall C above. The loading dock became controlled motion. SWAT officers moving pallets of bottled water across the floor, stacking them against the wall between the trailer and the columns, a forklift edging crates into position. 2 maintenance men who had refused to leave the building appeared from a side door. Leon Black, solid gray beard, a Braves cap on straight, who said he knew the dock better than any of them and proved it by directing the table stacking with the efficient authority of a man who has spent 20 years working in a space and knows exactly which angles matter. and a second man, older, white-haired and thin, with bad knees and good hands, who dragged sandbags without being asked. Ellis opened the side panel of the trailer with a thin tool, and the care of a man who knows that the next 30 seconds will either be fine or will be the last 30 seconds he has. And inside was a compact control assembly timer blinking red secondary battery pack, a dead man circuit, and a small blue jumper bridging the timer to the backup power supply. 8 seconds on the timer. Dara looked at the assembly, and the memory she had been pressing down all morning came up fully, completely without permission. A service corridor 6 years ago, a junction box half an inch too high, her voice saying, "Wait," command, saying "move," and the world becoming white, and then silence, and then 7 names on a sealed envelope that she had carried every day since. She had been right then and had not been heard in time. The blue jumper. Not data. Not a ground. A bridge, the connection between the countdown and the power source that would complete the circuit if someone cut the wrong thing first. "Cut the blue jumper," she said. Ellis looked at her. 1 second. The look of a man who is not doubting her, who is simply recording the moment before he acts on someone else's certainty, because this is the kind of decision that deserves to be witnessed even if there is no time for discussion. He cut it. The timer stopped at 4 seconds. The red light died. The loading dock did not move. The columns held. The concourse above them, with its service offices and storage areas, remained attached to the rest of the building. Leon sat down heavily on a stack of tables and pressed both hands against his knees and looked at the ceiling. The white-haired man crossed himself quietly against the wall. Whitfield lowered his head for one moment, the small private gesture of a person releasing something they have been holding at tension for too long. Denise's voice through the earpiece timer signal is gone. "Confirm status, please." Ellis's voice had the sound of a man who has been holding his breath and discovered he has more air than he expected. "Device disabled." "Repeat, device disabled." Dara looked at the dead timer for a moment. 7 names in her bag. 7 people who had died because the wrong assumption moved faster than the truth. Not again. She picked up the torn leather bag from the floor where she had set it and looked at Whitfield. "1 bomb," she said. He understood. "Voss, and whoever is above him." Voss was in medical custody at headquarters, arm treated and in a sling. Composure returned in the way that certain men's composure returns, not because they have processed anything, but because composure is the tool they reach for when everything else has been taken away, and some men hold on to it past the point where it serves any purpose except pride. He would not speak to anyone except Dara. He said this through his attorney, through the attending medic, through the federal officer stationed outside the door, with the patience of a man who believes he still holds something that someone else needs badly enough to come back for. Dara returned to the station at 10:47. The lobby was different now, not rearranged. Nothing moved, but different in the way a room is different after something true has happened in it. Officers stood as she came through the door. Not all at once, not as ceremony, but one by one, the way ordinary people stand when they have decided that something deserves acknowledgement even if no one told them to. The veteran from the plastic chair had not left. He rose when he saw her slower than he had risen before and pointed at her torn bag with the directness of a very old man who has long since stopped worrying about whether a thing needs to be said and just says it. Worlds full of fools who don't know the difference between old and worthless. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes, sir." He tapped 2 fingers to the brim of his veteran's cap. "Carry him proud." He meant the photograph. He meant her father. He had seen her pick it up off the floor that morning, and he had remembered because old men who have served remember the things that deserve to be remembered. Medical interview. One smelled of antiseptic and something older beneath it. The institutional smell of rooms where difficult things are said in controlled settings that are never quite controlled enough. Voss sat at the metal table with his left arm bandaged and his right hand resting flat on the tabletop, and his posture was the posture of a man who has decided that this is a performance and he knows how the performance goes. Dara placed her torn bag on the table between them and sat across from him without opening her notebook. She watched him the way she watched evidence, not looking for something specific, just receiving whatever was there to be received. He told her eventually, because silence applied with patience is more persuasive than almost any other tool, he told her that Dallas was not supposed to kill the whole team, that the target was one person, Assistant Director Helen Marsh, who had found the procurement channel, seized military-grade explosives moving from federal storage into private hands, domestic groups, militia organizations, contractors who needed power without traceability and had enough money to pay for it. Marsh had found the channel. She had the names, the timeline, the mechanism. She had built the case from the inside, and she had been killed to bury it. Dara listened without her face moving. Marsh's name was the 7th name in the envelope, the one she had added last 3 years ago when a colleague who had been at Dallas with her told her quietly and with evident fear that Marsh had been the real target, and that whoever ordered it was still active and still protected. Voss would not give her the name above him. Not here, not with a camera. He had insurance, he said, and she should know that already. She did know it. Every corrupt man believed himself careful, and every careful man kept something that would bring down his partners if they moved against him first. The contractor's phone data gave her a location: South Atlanta Veterans Outreach Center off Cascade Road, a nonprofit. Voss sat on the board. He had attended their fundraisers for 9 years and given speeches about service and community, and no one who saw him shake old soldiers' hands had ever thought to look at what else his hands were holding. Holloway was in the hallway when Dara came out. He had been waiting, which was something she had not expected from him, and he stood in the way of a man who has had several hours to think about who he is and has not liked any of what he found. He looked at the torn strap on her bag, and he said in a voice stripped of every performative quality, "I was wrong." She stopped. "You owe this city an accounting," she said, and her voice was even not angry, not vindicated, just honest. "You owe your officers a better example, and you owe every black woman who walks into your building after me more than words." He lowered his eyes. It was not forgiveness, and she did not offer it as such, because forgiveness was not hers to give on behalf of the city and the officers and every other woman who had walked through that lobby and been made to feel small by a man who mistook a badge for a measurement of worth. But it was a beginning of consequence, and consequences, when they are real ones, are where change actually starts. Dempsey caught her near the exit. He held up her badge case, which she had left in the operations room. Their fingers touched briefly when she took it. "I should have helped in the lobby," he said. "Yes," she said. "Then help now." The South Atlanta Veterans Outreach Center sat behind a small Baptist church on a street shaded by live oaks, a brick building with a wheelchair ramp and 2 flagpoles, and a hand-painted sign near the entrance reading, "Coffee Claims Help Fellowship, Tuesdays and Thursdays." On the side wall, a mural soldiers from Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, painted with the kind of careful attention that means someone spent real time on every face. Voss had hidden something in a place where old veterans came when the government became too complicated, when paperwork felt like another war, when loneliness got loud in the afternoon. That fact made Dara's anger colder rather than hotter. Not the sudden flare of something ignited, but the slow, sustained temperature of something that has burned too long and too quietly and is not going to go out. Inside storage room at the end of the hallway, metal cabinet with a new lock in a room where everything else was old. Server tower encrypted drives, a stack of manila envelopes in sealed plastic, each labeled with a handwritten code. One of the codes read Dallas/Marsh. One read Procurement/GV. The shape of what Voss had built was physical now, not a theory, not a pattern in data, but paper and drives and sealed envelopes in a room full of donated winter coats. Mrs. Alberta Green, 72 years old, lavender cardigan and a church hat with a pearl pin. Hands raised, standing near the kitchen doorway of the fellowship hall with the expression of a woman who has been frightened by what came through the door but is not going to be undone by it. She worked here. 2 men had come 20 minutes ago and told her to go home. She had not gone because she had been coming to this building for 12 years, and she knew every person who was supposed to have a key to the storage room, and these men did not look like any of them. Most men, she told them when she explained about the tunnel to the church basement that Voss's people were using to move the drives, don't see what women keep working. The tunnel chase was short and resolved the way things resolve when a 61-year-old sergeant with sore knees takes the exterior route and arrives where he needs to arrive exactly when he needs to arrive there. Dempsey hit the man low in the church basement, both of them going down hard on the old tile, and when the suspect told him to get off, Dempsey pressed his knee between the man's shoulders and said, breathing hard, "Son, I have been waiting all morning to be useful." The drive case held a solid-state drive, a handwritten ledger, and a photograph sealed in plastic Voss Marsh, and a third man who wore no uniform, but whose face Dara recognized from oversight committee hearings and closed-door federal briefings. Senator Dale Whitmore, who had spent 20 years building his career on veterans affairs and national security and the kind of patriotism that sounds like a promise until you look at what it covers. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Whitfield beside her. "Who is it?" Dara slid the photograph back into the case. "Someone higher than Voss. Mrs. Green from the top of the basement stairs. Is this going to hurt the center?" Dara looked around at the folding chairs, the donated coats, the bulletin board with its photographs of cookouts and Christmas drives and old men who had outlived most of their units and came here on Tuesdays and Thursdays because someone was supposed to keep faith with them. "No, ma'am," she said. "It's going to hurt the men who used it." In the church basement, beneath a framed Sunday school drawing of Noah's Ark, a SWAT technician set up a portable signal isolation unit on a folding table and prepared to play an audio file that had arrived on Dara's cracked phone from an unknown encrypted relay. 6 words in the message itself. Dallas was authorized. "Stand down now, with the audio attached." The room was quiet in the way that certain rooms are quiet before something changes the shape of everything. The file began with static, then 3 voices. Voss Younger, his voice had the same controlled quality, but lighter, less practiced, the voice of a man who was still building the person he would become. Helen Marsh, sharp, angry in the precise way of someone who has tried every other register and found none of them adequate to the situation. And Senator Dale Whitmore, calm, patient, with the deliberate pace of a man who speaks slowly because he has learned that slowness reads as authority and has been using that lesson for 4 decades. "You let Dallas proceed," Marsh said. "You knew civilians and agents would die." "Sacrifices were made," Whitmore said, "to protect a channel vital to national stability." "You mean profitable," Marsh said. A chair scraped. Then Whitmore again, and this time his voice carried a specific quality that Dara had heard before in closed-door meetings when men of a certain kind of power moved from discussion to instruction. "If Agent Okafor gets too close, remove her." He used her name. Not a designation, not a title, not the federal investigator or the agent her name, which meant he had been tracking her specifically for long enough that her name was in the part of his vocabulary he reached for without thinking. The basement held the sentence for a long moment, the way rooms hold certain things after they have been said in them. Mrs. Green whispered something that was not quite words. Whitfield's jaw was tight. Dara stood with her eyes on the isolation unit and her face doing the specific work of processing something enormous in a space too small and too important to afford falling apart in. Whitfield said quietly, "We have him. Dara. Not until the public record has him too." Denise through the radio, her voice with the tight urgency of someone who has been watching something develop from a distance and can no longer wait to report it. Senator Whitmore's office had already issued a statement. A rogue federal agent, they said, interfering with an active investigation in illegal possession of classified materials. The statement had gone to every regional news desk and 3 national wire services simultaneously. They had been ready with it. The statement had been drafted before Dara found the evidence case, which meant someone had told them it might be found, which meant the man who built the trap had also built the escape from it. She knew this move. She had watched institutions make it before, not in any single grand gesture, but in the accumulated small decisions of powerful people who have learned that the fastest way to neutralize a truth is to question the person carrying it. First the tone, then the authority, then the judgment. Then whether she ever belonged in the room at all. Denise Dara said, "Release the audio simultaneously. Federal oversight. The State Attorney General and every major newsroom in the country at the same time, not sequentially. All at once, no single door that can be closed." A pause on the line. Then Denise copy. Whitfield gave Ruiz the signal. Ruiz coordinated with the tech unit, and 37 seconds later, Senator Dale Whitmore's voice began moving through America, calm, patient, deliberate, telling the country what he had told two people in a room he believed was private, that the lives of federal agents were a currency he was comfortable spending, that a black woman who came too close to the truth could simply be removed, that sacrifice was the word he used for other people's deaths in service of his own interests. The trap had been built to neutralize her. The audio turned it inside out. Dempsey's voice through the channel from headquarters strained and quiet. Two of Whitmore's staffers just showed up at the front desk. "They're asking for Chief Holloway by name." Holloway's voice for the first time all morning carrying something other than authority. "Tell them I'm not available." A beat. Then Holloway again, quieter. "Tell them to leave." It was not heroism. It was a man making the smallest possible choice in the right direction. But even small choices made at the right moment have consequences that ripple outward in ways the person making them cannot see from where they stand, and Dara heard it through the channel and felt it land. She picked up her torn bag and the evidence case and looked at Whitfield. "I need to be at the veterans' tents," she said, "before Whitmore's people get ahead of this story." Whitfield looked at the church basement. The folding chairs, the old hymnals, the drive case with its photograph of a senator who had spent 20 years using veterans as backdrop for a performance. And then he looked at Dara's torn bag with its broken strap and the safety pin Mrs. Green had used to hold it together, and he said, "Let's go." The reporters found her before she reached the sidewalk because reporters find people. It is what they are trained to do, and what they found was a black woman in a dusty coat, with a torn bag on her forearm and a line of grease on one cuff from a loading dock floor, and the specific composure of someone who has been through a great deal in the last 3 hours and is not pretending otherwise. Cameras turned. Microphones came up. Questions arrived in the overlapping rush of a dozen voices reaching for the same story from different angles. "Are you under investigation? Did you interfere with the police response? Are you connected to the attack? Is it true you're a rogue agent?" Dara did not answer any of them. Not because she was avoiding the questions, but because she was not walking toward the cameras. She was walking toward the veterans' tents across the street, where old men in wheelchairs and women with folded programs and grandchildren waving small American flags were still processing the news that their morning had been close to something terrible, and the reporters followed because that is what they do. And in following her to the tents, they followed the story to where it actually lived. A man in a Korean War veteran's cap sitting in his wheelchair with a small American flag in his lap looked up as Dara approached the tent. He had seen her that morning in the convention center corridor being gently moved with everyone else, and he had a veteran's memory for faces that had not been damaged by time. His wife stood beside the wheelchair and said, "Is that the woman they're talking about on the news?" He tightened his grip on his flag. News talks too much. Dara stopped in the shade of the tent among the wheelchairs and walkers and folded programs and the specific quiet of people who have survived enough to know the difference between an ordinary morning and a morning that almost wasn't. She did not ask for a microphone. She did not look for a podium. She stood where she was and spoke to the veterans rather than the cameras, and the cameras recorded it because that was the only story happening. "My name is Dara Okafor," she said. "I am a special agent with the Federal Counterterrorism Division. This morning, a device was placed in this area with the intention of killing civilians, veterans, police officers, and first responders gathered here to honor service." She paused. "That device was stopped," She waited for the noise of that to settle, then continued. It was stopped by many people. Some of them wore uniforms, some wore volunteer badges. Some pushed wheelchairs, some carried trays of coffee. Some sang in a choir so that no one nearby would panic. One woman produced a safety pin out of nowhere when someone needed one. None of them are going to be in the headlines tomorrow. She looked at the veterans. You know those people. You've served alongside versions of them your whole lives. She lifted the evidence case. The people behind this attack expected confusion. They expected pride to slow us down. They expected, and she let the next phrase come out plainly without heat prejudice to make me invisible long enough for them to finish what they started. The word landed. Several officers near the police line looked away. Several others did not. Phones buzzed across the crowd, reporters, producers, spectators as the audio file reached the newsrooms. Senator Dale Whitmore's voice, calm and precise, began moving through the country's speakers and screens and earbuds. Sacrifices were made to protect a channel vital to national stability. If she gets too close, remove her. A Vietnam veteran near the front of the tent line pushed himself to his feet slowly with help from his son. That man came to our fundraiser, he said. He shook my hand. His voice carried the specific, bewildered dignity of someone who has just discovered that something they trusted was hollow. Mrs. Alberta Green, standing near the church steps across the street, called out at a volume that surprised everyone, including herself. He shook a lot of hands he didn't deserve to touch. The crowd, veterans, families, officers, bystanders. Press produced a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a gasp, but was something that happens when a lie breaks open in public and people who were inside it suddenly understand where they have been standing. Federal marshals arrived from a black SUV and approached Dara for the evidence case. She made them sign the chain of custody transfer on camera in front of the veterans' tents in full view of every recording device pointed at her. The chain of evidence would be in 5 places before Whitmore's office could respond to 2 of them. She released the case only when the signature was complete and documented. Whitfield appeared at her elbow. "Ceremony's been moved outside," he said quietly. "They're asking if you'll say a few words." Dara shook her head. "This day belongs to them." An old veteran near the tent line, not the man from the wheelchair, a different one, taller, with a Desert Storm patch on his left shoulder, and the careful posture of a man whose knees have been arguing with him for 20 years, looked at her steadily and said, "Then stand with us." Mrs. Green materialized beside Dara and produced a safety pin from the pocket of her lavender cardigan from some interior pocket that seemed to contain exactly what the moment required, and fastened the broken strap of the torn leather bag with the efficient care of a woman who has been keeping things together for a very long time. "Not pretty," Mrs. Green said, "but it'll carry." Dara looked at the repaired strap, looked at the woman's face, the lines around her eyes, the steadiness in her expression, the specific dignity of a person who has been underestimated so many times that she has simply stopped factoring it into her calculations. "Thank you," Dara said. Mrs. Green patted her arm once. "Baby, that's what we do. We keep things from falling apart." Raymond Holloway arrived at the Convention Center Plaza at 11:15 in full uniform, and the reporters found him inside of 30 seconds, because reporters at scenes like this are always looking for the next layer of the story, and the chief of Atlanta Police Department arriving after everything has been resolved is a layer worth examining. "Chief Holloway, did you delay Agent Okafor this morning? Did you assault her in the lobby? Were racist remarks made inside your station?" He flinched at the word racist with the specific flinch of a man who does not deny what he did, but finds the word for it somehow more damaging than the doing of it, as though the naming of a thing is a greater injury than the thing itself, which is one of the particular confusions that certain kinds of men carry through their lives without examining. He looked across the plaza. He looked at the veterans in their tents. He looked at Dempsey standing quietly near the tent line, with his hands at his sides, and his face carrying the expression of a man who has decided to spend the rest of his career trying to make up for the first part of the morning. He looked at the torn leather strap hanging from Dara's forearm. "I was wrong." The words came out without performance, without the modulation of a man managing his public image, and maybe that was what made the reporters go quiet. Not the words themselves, but the sound of them. The raw, stripped quality of a man saying something true without a strategy underneath it. I failed to verify Agent Okafor's credentials when she arrived. I delayed the response to an active threat situation. I treated her with disrespect that I would not have shown to any other federal officer who came through that door. He paused. A breath. I put my pride before my duty. That's what happened, and I'm not going to dress it up. He turned toward Dara, who was standing 20 feet away near the edge of the veteran's tent. She met his gaze without warmth and without hostility, the specific neutral attention of a woman who is deciding what this moment is worth, rather than what it feels like. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the reporters stopped typing and the cameras held still and the veterans nearest to them turned their attention to this particular exchange. "No," she said, and her voice was even unhurried, carrying the same quality it had carried all morning, the quality of accuracy rather than anger. "You owe this city an accounting. You owe your officers a better example. You owe every black woman who walks into your building after me more than words." Holloway's eyes dropped. It landed in him the way true things land, not like a blow, but like something settling into the place it was always going to end up eventually. It was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was not what Dara had to give here, and offering it would have been dishonest, would have let Holloway feel resolved when he should feel accountable, which was a different thing entirely. Accountability was the starting line, not the finish. It was where people who intended to actually change had to begin, and the people who were not going to change would use the word accountability and mean something much smaller and easier to step away from. Holloway lowered his eyes. He did not step away. Behind them, the veterans began to applaud slowly at first, then, with more certainty, not synchronized, not orchestrated, just the spontaneous response of people who have watched something true happen and want to acknowledge that they witnessed it. Not for Holloway, whose acknowledgement was too new and too small to deserve applause yet. Not even entirely for Dara, though she was the center of what they were affirming. For the fact that the morning had not ended in smoke. For the old, reliable, badly battered truth that service means standing between danger and people who will never learn your name, and that sometimes, not always, not easily, not without cost, it works. A bugler moved into position near the flagpole at the edge of the plaza, and the first notes of taps moved through the Atlanta air with the specific quality of that melody. The way it seems to expand, rather than simply travel, filling the space between people and the space inside them at the same time. And the veterans straightened, and the families straightened, and the volunteers stopped moving and stood where they were, and the reporters lowered their devices by a few inches. Dara stood among them under the shade of the veterans' tent with her repaired bag on her shoulder and the 7 names in her sealed envelope and the photograph of Isaiah Okafor safe in the inside pocket where she always kept it, and she listened to the bugle and did not look away. Whitfield found her near the edge of the tent after the bugle finished carrying 2 paper cups of convention center coffee that was bad in the specific way of large institutional events that have been through an emergency and then resumed operations, which is to say it was terrible and still better than nothing. He handed her one. "Bad," he said. "I know," she said, and took it. They stood without talking for a while, which was not uncomfortable, the way silence is uncomfortable between people who do not know each other well, but was instead the silence of 2 people who have been through something and are letting the aftermath be what it needs to be before anything else is required of them. The plaza had quieted. Families were boarding buses. Volunteers were folding tablecloths and stacking chairs with the careful efficiency of people who have been doing this at events for decades and know exactly how long it takes to put the world back in order after something happens to interrupt it. A few veterans sat in the remaining chairs in the shade, not ready to leave yet, perhaps not quite believing yet that leaving was safe, which was a response Dara recognized and did not judge. She told Whitfield about Dallas, not the operational summary which he had access to through department channels if he chose to look. She told him the true shape of it, the way she had known something was wrong. The details she had caught the command that overrode her, the 7 people who were alive and then were not, and the specific quality of surviving something that you tried to prevent and could not, which is different from survivor's guilt in the way that most named things are different from the actual experience they are supposed to describe. The 7th name, she said, was Marsh. I added it 3 years ago when someone who had been there told me she was the real target. I've been working toward her name ever since. Whitfield held his bad coffee and looked at the flags, and did not say the things that people often say when someone tells them a story like this, did not say, "It wasn't your fault," or "you couldn't have known," or any of the other things that are meant to be comforting and are often just the speaker's way of moving away from a grief they don't know how to sit beside. Instead, he said, "She had you." Dara was quiet for a moment. "She's been dead for 6 years. "I know," Whitfield said. "She still had you. You were still looking for her. That's not nothing." It was not the thing Dara expected him to say. And because it was not what she expected, it reached her in a way that prepared answers cannot reach a person past the surface that manages those answers, and into the part underneath that has been waiting for something true to land there. Dempsey came across the plaza toward them with the careful posture of a man who is not sure of his welcome and has decided to come anyway because the alternative is cowardice. He stopped at a respectful distance and said he had given his full statement to Internal Affairs, 31 pages every detail from the lobby, forward names and times, and exactly what he had chosen to do and what he had not chosen to do and why, and that he would testify in whatever capacity was useful. "I should have stepped in sooner," he said. "Yes," Dara said. "Then you stepped in. That's what matters now." Dempsey's eyes watered. He did not wipe them. "My father used to say that a man's last years show whether his first lessons took." He looked at the convention center. He was a veteran. He came to the outreach center sometimes after my mother died. They helped him file his VA appeal. Voss used to give speeches at their fundraisers. He said it quietly, the way you say things that are both ordinary and terrible at the same time. "I know," Dara said. "I saw the photograph." Mrs. Green appeared at her elbow from somewhere, as Mrs. Green tended to appear with the uncanny timing of a woman who has spent enough decades paying attention that she knows when she is needed, carrying the folded photograph of Isaiah Okafor, which Dara had left tucked in a program near her chair during the ceremony. "You almost forgot him," she said. Dara took the photograph with both hands and looked at her father for a moment. Young and straight and proud in his army dress uniform, completely unaware of all the mornings his daughter would spend needing his voice, completely unaware that the things he had taught her in ordinary moments of an ordinary life would become the architecture of how she survived extraordinary ones. Mrs. Green touched her arm lightly. "Men like Whitmore use the flag like a curtain baby. Your father wore it like a promise. Don't you ever confuse the two." Dara stood in the shade of the veteran's tent with the photograph of Isaiah Okafor in her hands and the sealed envelope with 7 names in the inside pocket of her bag, and the safety pin holding the torn strap together. And she understood that the weight she had been carrying had not disappeared, and was not going to disappear. 7 people were still dead, and a senator was still being escorted toward the accountability. He had spent decades believing he was beyond, and the country was still a place where a black woman had to survive an hour of being made invisible before anyone would listen to what she knew about how to save them all, and none of that had changed. But the weight was different now. It was no longer hers alone. It was in the public record, in the drive cases, in the audio files, moving through every newsroom in the country, in Dempsey's 31-page statement, in Mrs. Green's testimony, in Karen Whitlock's quiet and extraordinary composure over a phone call that she had handled better than anyone had a right to expect. The 7 names were not ghosts anymore. They were witnesses. And witnesses, when they are finally heard, become something more than grief. She put the photograph away and stood in the shade and listened to the last of the afternoon settle around her. And for the first time in 3 years, the envelope in her pocket felt less like a wound and more like a record, not closed but documented. which is the first thing justice requires before it can move. 3 days after the operation, the federal investigation of Senator Dale Whitmore was officially announced, and the wire services carried it nationally in the spare, specific language of a story that does not need embellishment because the facts are enough. A United States senator had authorized the deaths of federal agents to protect an illegal network that seized military-grade explosives into private hands, and the evidence was in multiple custodial locations simultaneously, which meant that no single office, no single favor, no single phone call from a senior enough person to a junior enough person was going to make it disappear. Whitmore's communications office issued a statement calling the audio recording selectively edited and taken out of context, and it was a professional statement, well-worded and appropriately outraged, and it landed in a country that had already heard his voice saying exactly what he had said, in exactly the tone in which he had said it, and the statement lasted about 4 news cycles before it stopped being quoted and started being described as an example of something else. The procurement channel itself took longer to dismantle these things, always do, because the networks that move illegal materials through legal-looking channels are built to survive the removal of any single piece, and Voss and the contractor and the gray sedan driver were pieces, not the whole. Federal investigators would spend the next 18 months following the ledger in the drive case through 4 additional names, 2 of whom carried security clearances that should have made the operation impossible, and all of whom had at some point been in a room with Helen Marsh before she died and had known what she was building toward. Marsh's personnel file was unsealed for the investigation, and inside it preserved by a colleague who had kept them in a personal archive without knowing their full significance, were her handwritten notes, the names, the timeline, the mechanism. Everything Dara had been reconstructing from the outside for 3 years. Marsh had built the full case before Dallas. She had been killed before she could deliver it. Dara read the file alone in a federal secure room on the 4th day, and she read all of it. And when she reached the final page, Marsh's last internal memorandum dated 3 days before Dallas recommending formal investigation of 5 named individuals. She opened the sealed envelope for the first time in the story and read all 7 names aloud quietly to herself in the order she had written them. Then she refolded the envelope and put it back. Not because she was done. She was not done, and the names were not going away, and justice for 7 people required more than a drive case in federal custody. But the names belonged to the living now. They were in the record. They had prosecutors and investigators and a public truth moving through the country at the speed that public truths move when they cannot be contained. Denise Pruitt received a commendation from the department and declined to make a statement to the press, which was the most Denise thing she could have done, and instead she called her sons and told them she was fine and let them ask questions she didn't entirely answer, and then she went home and sat in the parking lot of her apartment building for 12 minutes before she was ready to go inside, which is what she always did after the hard nights. And this had been, in its way, the hardest night of all. Dempsey's testimony to Internal Affairs ran to 31 pages, which was 11 more pages than anyone expected from a man known for saying little, and it read less like a formal deposition, and more like a letter written by someone who has decided to be honest about himself at an age when honesty is harder because there is less future to improve in. He named what he had seen and what he had chosen not to stop, and exactly what the distance between those 2 things had cost in the lobby of a police station on a Saturday morning, and the document was thorough and unsparing, and it was the beginning of what Roy Dempsey intended to spend his remaining years on the job becoming. Holloway was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and his office door remained closed, and the bronze plaque in the lobby with its gold-lettered names of fallen officers was photographed by a reporter and published alongside a caption about what names mean and what it costs when the institution bearing them fails to honor what they represent. And that caption, which was not an editorial but simply a sentence that described what was true, circulated for weeks. The Senate subcommittee called Whitmore to a preliminary hearing within 10 days of the audio's release, and he appeared with his full legal team and the composure of a man who has spent 4 decades learning that composure is indistinguishable from innocence to people who are watching quickly and without full information. And he used the language of institutional complexity and contextual nuance and the regrettable mischaracterization of private strategic discussions, and it was a very good performance. The audio did not leave the room when he did. It had been downloaded and clipped and re-aired so many times by so many people in so many contexts that it had become the kind of thing the public carries around without entirely knowing they are carrying it, a sentence that has worked its way into the general understanding of what a particular kind of powerful man sounds like when he believes no one important is listening. If she gets too close, remove her. That sentence had been said about a black woman by a senator in a closed room about a problem that turned out to be her knowledge of something true, and the country heard it with all of those facts attached, and the country was not entirely ready to forgive it. 3 women in Decatur, Georgia, who had met in a grief support group for military widows and had been meeting for 9 years every other Thursday in the back room of a church that also hosted a veterans outreach program, drafted an open letter to the Senate Ethics Committee. They were not affiliated with any national organization. They did not have a publicist or a social media strategy. They had a kitchen table and 2 evenings and a shared history of watching the government use the word service to mean something it asked of their husbands and sons without reciprocating. 12 senators read the letter, and none of them could publicly ignore it because it was signed with names, and the names had military records attached. And in this country, at this moment, that combination had a specific weight. The procurement channel investigation widened steadily the way these things widen when the initial case is solid enough to sustain pressure. 4 additional names, 2 security clearances that should have prevented the operation. And at the center of all of it, Helen Marsh's handwritten notes dated and time-stamped describing everything she had found and everything she intended to do with it and the specific names of the people she believed were going to try to stop her. She had been right about every name. She had been right about all of it. She had been dead for 6 years. Dara read the notes in a secure room and felt something shift that had been fixed in place inside her since Dallas. Not grief leaving, which is not how grief works, but grief changing its posture, moving from accusation to something quieter and more permanent. The specific weight of having been right all along about what someone deserved and finally watching the record confirm it. Whitmore's Atlanta office was locked down on the same day the subcommittee announced the preliminary hearing. His communications director resigned within the week. His chief of staff stopped returning calls from people who had considered themselves allies. The money that had flowed toward his next campaign cycle began flowing in different directions quietly and without announcement. The way money moves when it is trying not to be associated with something anymore. None of those people issued statements. None of them needed to. Money speaks most clearly when it stops speaking. Back in Atlanta in the evenings, Dara worked through the final documentation of the operation evidence chain confirmations, chain of custody verifications, the 10 separate reports that federal protocol required for an operation of this scope. She worked in a borrowed office at the FBI field office in Midtown and ate takeout from a Thai restaurant 2 blocks over and watched the city lights through a window that faced west and thought about Marsh, who had sat in rooms like this in another city, in another time, building a case that was going to get her killed and had kept building it anyway and had been right about everything. She thought about what it cost to be right when the people who needed you to be wrong had more power than you did. She thought about the 7 names. She thought about the fact that Marsh's name was among them, and that Marsh had not died because she failed. She had died because she succeeded. And the difference between those 2 things was the whole argument for doing the work regardless. On the last evening, before she flew back to Washington, Dara sat in the borrowed office and opened her notebook to the page of columns. Times camera codes, vehicle descriptions, the handwriting that had been there when Holloway grabbed her bag and scattered everything across the lobby floor. And she read back through the morning, from the beginning, every notation, every timestamp, every detail she had written before she walked through those doors. She closed the notebook. She set it in the bag. The safety pin Mrs. Green had used to hold the strap together was still there, holding it. She was ready to go home. Roy Dempsey drove to the South Atlanta Veterans Outreach Center on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks after the operation, and he went alone, and he told no one where he was going, which was the kind of decision that only matters in the doing of it rather than the announcing. The center looked exactly as it had before: brick front wheelchair ramp flagpoles, the painted mural with its soldiers from every generation along the side wall, the hand-painted sign near the door. The difference was on the inside, where the bulletin board had been reorganized and the space where Garrett Voss's photograph had hung for 9 years was empty. Mrs. Alberta Green had taken the photograph down the morning after his arrest and had not yet decided what to replace it with. Which she told Dempsey when he came through the door was not an accident, but a choice. The space needed to be empty for a while, because it had been holding something false, and empty spaces deserve time to become something true. Dempsey told her he wanted to volunteer. He said it plainly, without preamble, the way people say things when they have decided on them and are worried that if they soften the approach, they will give themselves room to back out. Mrs. Green looked at him for a moment with the evaluating expression of a woman who has had many people come through her door over the years with varying degrees of genuine intention. "You're not doing this for me," she said. It was not a question. "No, ma'am," Dempsey said. "My father used to come here. After my mother died, your people helped him file his VA appeal. He said it was the first time in years he felt like someone in an official capacity was actually on his side." He looked at the empty space on the bulletin board. "And I want to earn back something I spent by looking away too many times." Mrs. Green looked at the empty space too. Then she looked at Dempsey. She did not offer him forgiveness. That was not what the moment required, and Mrs. Green had not gotten to 72 by confusing what moments required. But she pulled a folding chair from against the wall and set it at the end of the long table and handed him a handwritten list of names. "Friday afternoons," she said. "These men come for coffee and company and someone to listen without watching the clock. Most of them have been through things the official record doesn't fully account for. Some of them have paperwork that needs sorting. Some of them just need a person to sit across from them for an hour who is paying attention." Dempsey looked at the list. 2 names on it were names he recognized from old case files. Men he had processed at various points in his career, men whose complaints he had signed off on with less attention than they deserved. He did not say this to Mrs. Green. He kept it as the weight it deserved, to be something to carry rather than explain. He showed up on Friday. He brought coffee, which turned out to be redundant because Mrs. Green already had coffee, but the gesture was noted. He sat at the table and listened mostly, which is harder than it sounds for a man who has spent 30 years in a profession built on speaking first and listening second. He got some of it wrong in the first weeks, interrupted too soon, offered solutions when the person across from him was still in the problem, brought his own frame of reference to things that deserve to be heard in their own frame. But he kept coming back, which is the most important part of most things, and slowly over Fridays he got better at it. Not perfect, not absolved. Better, which is the only direction that matters in the long project of becoming someone who earns the trust that his badge had spent 30 years assuming. On the 3rd Friday, an older man named Thomas, who had come to the center for 4 years and had a VA claim that had been pending for longer than that, pushed a folder of documents across the table toward Dempsey and said without warmth but without hostility, "I hear you used to be a cop." "I still am," Dempsey said. Thomas looked at the folder, then at Dempsey. "Then maybe you can explain to me why the paperwork keeps disappearing." Dempsey pulled the folder toward him and opened it. "Let's find out," he said. It was a beginning, not a redemption. That word is too large and too easy and belongs to a different kind of story, but a beginning which is the honest word for what it was. 6 weeks after the operation, the Atlanta field station had an interim chief and a new desk officer at the front counter, and a memo posted in the briefing room that outlined updated protocols for the verification of federal credentials. A 4-paragraph document written in plain language that described exactly what should have happened on a Saturday morning in October, and had not, and what was going to happen now, and why the difference mattered. The lobby was the same lobby. Bronze plaque on the far wall, security camera in the upper corner, the plastic chair beneath the plaque where a veteran had sat all morning waiting for something that turned out not to arrive until almost noon. The scuff marks on the tile where a bag had been yanked open and scattered across the floor were still faintly visible if you knew where to look, and some of the people who worked in the building did look in the way that you look at the place where something happened when you need to remember that it happened. At 8:30 on a Thursday morning, a young black woman came through the front doors with a government ID badge case in one hand and a folder of documents in the other. She moved with the confidence of someone who has done this kind of work before and knows what she is here to do, and she stopped at the front desk and set her folder down and began to explain what she needed. The desk officer, 26 years old, 3 years on the job, a man who had been in the operations room the morning of the operation and had stood near the hallway door and had heard everything, looked up when she spoke. He looked at her face. And in the moment before he responded, in the 1-second gap between receiving someone's presence and deciding how to meet it, his eyes went to the security camera in the upper corner of the lobby, and then to the bronze plaque with its gold-lettered names, and then back to her face. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, professional and unhurried, making no judgment about what she looked like or what she was carrying or where she had come from. "How can I help you?" The woman set her folder on the desk and explained. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not look past her at something more important. He did not reach for her belongings or measure her worth against her appearance or decide that she needed to earn something before he would extend to her the basic professional courtesy that the job he had chosen required him to extend to every person who came through those doors. It was a small thing. It was an ordinary thing. It was, depending on how you measure these things, the most important thing that happened in that building since October. Dempsey came through the lobby 10 minutes later on his way to his shift. His footsteps unhurried. His uniform pressed his face, carrying the expression of a man who is working at something. He passed the front desk and saw the exchange, the woman explaining, the officer listening, the folder open between them, and he kept walking because it was going well without him, and his job was not to supervise it, but to notice it and let it be what it was. He slowed near the bronze plaque, read the first 3 names, the 4th, paused at the 5th, a name he recognized from before his time, an officer who had died in a way that had become part of the station's institutional story about what service cost and what it meant. He stood there for a moment, not long, just long enough to acknowledge something. Then he continued toward the operations floor and his shift and the long, slow work of becoming the kind of officer that the plaque was supposed to represent. The lobby did not know it had changed. Lobbies rarely know this about themselves. Change does not announce itself in rooms. It announces itself in what the people inside those rooms do on ordinary mornings, when no one is recording, and no one will write about it. And the only person who will know whether the right thing was done is the person who did it. The young woman finished her business at the desk and gathered her folder and thanked the officer and walked toward the hallway. He directed her toward, and she did not think anything specific about how she had been received, because it had been ordinary, professionally ordinary, adequately ordinary. The kind of ordinary that should have always been the standard, and was now in this building beginning to become one. Ordinary is where the work lives, not in the moments that end up in news coverage or federal investigations or sealed envelopes with 7 names. In the moments before all of that, in the lobbies and the hallways and the conversations that never get documented, where a person's worth is measured by 10,000 small daily choices made by people who have the power to get them right or wrong. The lobby did not know it had changed, but it had. Dara's last day in Atlanta before the flight back to Washington started early, as her days tended to in the particular quiet of a city that has not yet assembled itself into the noise it is going to become, and is still just streets and light and the smell of coffee from open doors. She walked to the Harmon Veterans Memorial Convention Center first because she wanted to see it in ordinary time, not in the compressed, heightened reality of an emergency, but in the regular morning of a city that had survived what had been planned for it and had returned to the business of being itself. The banners from the memorial had been taken down. The plaza was ordinary again. A maintenance worker moved a hose slowly across the concrete near the entrance, washing away the residue of an extraordinary weekend. She stood across the street and looked at the building for a few minutes and thought about the old couples, the wheelchairs, the folded programs, the choir singing in the dark while a wire ran beneath them, and she thought about what it means to stand guard for people who do not know you are there. People who will go home and argue about whose turn it is to put out the trash and watch whatever is on, and fall asleep in their chairs. People whose ordinary lives are the whole point, the entire reason, the thing that makes the work worth doing. She thought about her father standing at the ironing board the night before Veterans Day, and she thought about Marsh building her case in a borrowed office, and she thought about Mrs. Green arriving at the outreach center every Tuesday and Thursday, because someone had to be there and she had decided it was going to be her. She thought about the fact that none of those people were famous. That was the point, she thought. That was exactly the point. She walked to the Veterans Outreach Center next because she wanted to say goodbye to Mrs. Green, and because Mrs. Green had a safety pin in her pocket and a photograph of someone who deserved to be remembered, and a way of saying things that made them land in the right place inside a person. Mrs. Green was reorganizing the bulletin board when Dara arrived, which seemed to be an ongoing project of careful curation rather than a task with a fixed endpoint. She had put something new in the space where Voss's photograph had been. Not a photograph of a person, but an index card in her own handwriting pinned carefully at eye level. "We are not here to be used. We are here to be seen." Dara read it twice. "That's a good one," she said. It needed saying, Mrs. Green said, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has found the right words for a thing she has known for a long time. She looked at the board for a moment, then at Dara. "He comes on Fridays now. That sergeant, Dempsey, doesn't say much. Sits and listens mostly. Gets things wrong sometimes, but he comes back." She straightened the index card by a fraction. "Listening's a skill. Most men have to relearn it somewhere around 60. "Most of us do," Dara said. Mrs. Green looked at her. "You going home today?" "Good." She said it the way certain older women say good, not as agreement, but as benediction. A word that means you have done what you came to do and now you should go and rest. She walked Dara to the door and held it open and said as Dara stepped through, "Come back sometime when there's no emergency. I'll make you real coffee." At the airport in the gate area, Dara sat with the torn leather bag on the seat beside her and the safety pin still doing its work on the broken strap, and she took the sealed envelope out of the inside pocket and held it without opening it. She did not need to read the names. She had them. She had always had them. What had changed was what they were now: not accusation, not grief, not the private debt she had been carrying since Dallas, but something closer to record. Evidence. The thing that endures when everything else is lost. She thought about Marsh, about a woman who had sat in a room and built a case and had known, probably somewhere in the way that certain people know things, that building it was going to cost her everything, and had built it anyway. Who had not survived to carry her own envelope, who had trusted that someone else would pick it up. Dara put the envelope back. She took out the photograph of Isaiah Okafor instead and looked at it for a moment. Her father, young and straight and certain in his uniform, looking back at her from another time. She looked at his face the way you look at someone who taught you the most important things you know, and felt the specific ache of missing someone who has been gone long enough that the missing has become part of how you carry yourself. A boarding announcement came over the speaker. Dara put the photograph away carefully, back where it had been in the inside pocket beside the 7 names. She picked up the bag. The safety pin held. She stood, and the strap held her weight, and she walked toward the gate in the unhurried way of a woman who knows where she is going and has already paid whatever the journey cost, and the bag was with her worn and repaired and carrying everything it needed to carry. And that was enough. Senator Dale Whitmore's name appeared in the federal indictment alongside Helen Marsh's, and for the first time in 6 years, Marsh's name was in a public document, not as a casualty number in a classified summary, but as a person, a federal officer who had done her job exactly as the job required, who had found the truth and carried it at cost, and who deserved the public record to reflect what she had known and why she had died knowing it. The 7 names in Dara's envelope were in the indictment, all of them, named as victims of a conspiracy that had been authorized at the highest levels of trust a government extends and then betrayed. The indictment did not bring them back. It did not undo Dallas or close the distance between who survived and who did not. But it moved them from the private grief of a sealed envelope into the permanent record of what happened and who was responsible for it, and that movement from private to public, from hidden to acknowledged, is the first thing justice requires before it can mean anything at all. On a Tuesday afternoon, the South Atlanta Veterans Outreach Center held its regular coffee hour, and the room was full in the particular way of places that have been through something and come out the other side with more people wanting to be part of them. Volunteers who had read about Mrs. Green in the news coverage. Veterans who had always known the center was there, but had never quite gotten around to coming. A few younger people who were not veterans themselves, but had decided that paying attention to the people around them who had served was a thing they could do. Mrs. Alberta Green moved between the tables the way she always had, unhurried and attentive, refilling cups, and remembering names and sitting down sometimes to listen to something that needed to be heard before it could be set down. Roy Dempsey was in the corner at the far table, his uniform jacket folded over the back of the chair, a folder of VA paperwork spread in front of him, and a man across from him who had been waiting 3 years for someone to help him understand why his claim kept being returned. Dempsey was not getting it all right, but he was getting more of it right than the week before, and the week before he had gotten more right than the week before that, and the man across the table with the folder had come back a 3rd time, which was its own kind of answer. On the bulletin board above the coffee station, the index card in Mrs. Green's handwriting caught the afternoon light. "We are not here to be used. We are here to be seen." In Atlanta, it rains the way it has always rained, without apology, without explanation, without pausing for anyone's pride or anyone's grief or anyone's careful plan that the weather was not consulted about. And on an ordinary Thursday morning, 6 weeks after an extraordinary Saturday, a black woman walked through the front doors of the Atlanta field station carrying a badge case and a folder of documents, and the ordinary authority of someone who belongs in the room she is walking into. The desk officer looked up before she reached the counter. He looked at her face. He said good morning. He listened to what she needed. He did not reach for her belongings. He did not measure her against anything except the question she had come to ask, which was the only measurement the job had ever actually required, and which had been for too long too often applied to too few of the people who came through those doors. It was not justice fully arrived. It was not the end of the work, or the answer to the question, or the resolution of every unresolved thing that had ever happened in a lobby like this one. But it was a morning, and in that morning a small true thing happened the way it was supposed to happen, and in the accumulated weight of small true things done correctly on ordinary mornings by ordinary people who have decided that it matters, that is how the larger truth eventually holds. One morning at a time. One door at a time. One person choosing to see another person clearly, and then the next person choosing and the next, until the choosing becomes the standard rather than the exception. Until the doing of it is so ordinary that the people inside it no longer notice they are doing something remarkable, because remarkable will have become, finally, what is simply expected. If this story stayed with you, if you heard something in it that felt true or saw someone you recognized in any of these moments, we would love to hear from you in the comments. Stories like this one exist because people like you watch them all the way to the end. Subscribe to our channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Every person you send it to is one more person who might choose on an ordinary morning to do the small, true thing.